Good morning. Today I will be presenting my topic is decoupling from China and EV task. So we'll first start with looking at what happens with Chinese export, and I'll show you the reasons behind our observation. We'll also talk about the strategies in coping with the current trend of global globalization and the vulnerability exposed. And following with that, I'll analyze the feasibility of the option to decouple from China, and in the end, to give you a brief conclusion to wrap up my presentation. So first of all, what happened with Chinese export? You can see from the graph at the right side, I would say that Chinese export is doing pretty good comparing with other countries, and it remains one of a few bright spots in Chinese economic activity, especially if you see from July 2022, it unexpectedly increased by 18% on a year-on-year basis, which beating the market forecast of 15%. However, in the following months, the increase has dropped a lot, which only obtained 7.1% increase, and it's below the market forecast of 12.8%. So in a short summary, I would say that China is still recovering from a sharp COVID-induced slump, and although the imports remain sluggish because of the negative hit of the pandemic to its businesses and consumers domestically, the exports growth remains one of the key drivers for its economic activity and development. However, the overall global demand was weakened, which drags on the shipment in the past several months. And you can also see that the price of container shipping is constantly falling. Someone may argue that we don't see the pressure right now from the current statistics, but the researcher side, we can expect the pressure coming in fourth quarter. So what are the possible reasons behind our observation? So the first reason I'll give is the continuous lockdown measures due to the pandemic. So for China, they have already a flight demand from overseas because of pandemic. However, domestically, their industrial production and retail sale performance are below expectation, and the country has to deal with droughts and heat waves, which force some cities and provinces to require the industrial factories to shut down because of power shortage. And the other aspect would be the soaring tension between US and China, because we all know like the trade war between these two biggest economy in the world worsening over years, ever since the US banned Huawei products to the US technology, and the two countries are imposing high tariffs on each other. So these two reasons together expose the vulnerability of global value chain, especially out of the geopolitical reasons. So speaking of the China and the US tension, I prepared a brief timeline which summarize some key critical time points in terms of the development of the tension. So from 2020 January, those two countries signed phase 1 trade war deal, which gives the global the war a temporary peace. However, the peace was broke down by the pandemic. So from November 2020, Trump ramps up pressure, and he regarded China as the biggest threat to the US economic development. So he started to blacklist a lot of Chinese enterprise, including the biggest chip maker, SMIC, on its banned trading list. And the situation didn't become better with the Biden administration takes control. So Biden decided to maintain the Trump high tariffs and even expand the Trump era ban. So from the Biden's perspective, he thinks like the US have to invest a lot in its own infrastructure and technological sector development to compete with China globally. So he sees China as the biggest competitor in United States perspective. And he even published those Biden's China strategy, which calls to revive the US competitiveness. So out of the current situation, the global supply chain network has been disrupted badly. And there are two main strategies being mentioned widely nowadays. The first one is decoupling. This means to dismantle the reliance on Chinese imports, which forcing many tariff companies to leave China and move to other countries like Vietnam or Southeastern Asia. And by doing so, this will coercing the supply chain and manufacturing to shift away from China. Different than decoupling, the other strategy is recoupling. So this aims to making efforts aimed at embedding the supply chain with sustainable framework, which will balance the need for efficiency against the visible newly security risk and vulnerability globally. Because not all foreign suppliers or countries are equally risky, and it's better to build in some redundancy for possible bottlenecks than to cut them away entirely. So next, I will be analyzing whether it is feasible to decouple from China. personally speaking, I don't think it's a wise decision or it's a feasible option to physically put into practice. And first of all, from Chinese perspective, China has already moved up the value chain by specializing in more sophisticated activities which are hard to replicate and even more difficult to replicate. They are taking on more orchestration responsibilities in the global value chain functioning, such as they manage the supplier network, they control like the raw material, they have the quality control, and so on. So which are all difficult to replicate. And also, if we decompose its export composition, we'll see that the manufacturing and technological machinery takes up 48% of its export. So these are all equipment and appliances in high-tech sector. So China is not capable of making more like complex and complicated products on their own. So between 2005 and 2015, its domestic content in total export has increased from 74% to 84%. If we take iPhone as an example, it has now takes a share of 24% in the bill of materials in iPhone X. From the US perspective, it is also a challenge to decouple from China entirely, because economy is not a discrete organism which can easily be separated from the global economy. The trade relationships are complicated, difficult, and expensive to replicate. For US firms, it's unlikely for them to rebuild completely the global value chain network. And even if they are compelled to do so, the cost would be passed on to the customers, which I believe US government wouldn't want to see from happening. And for foreign companies other than China, they may want to avoid or reduce contact with US firms because they kind of fear that this geopolitical tension might pass on them someday in the future. And the series of sanctions towards China and this competition might inspire China to further innovate while simultaneously cutting US out of its innovative system. So combining or integrating all of my points, I would say it will be impossible to fully separate the US and Chinese economies, and this long-term conjoined adversary relationship is not good for both parties and the global economy. So the best suggestion would be those two biggest economies in the world to make efforts to recouple the global value chain instead of cutting out from one country specifically. So that's all for my presentation, and thank you for listening.